Welcome to Shakespeare the Whole Year, a series of research based, student friendly talks on various aspects of Shakespeare and his works, hosted by the Shakespeare Society of India East Zone under the aegis of SSI New Delhi. Lecture number 3, to be delivered by Dr. Ratna Guha Mustafi, is titled A Brief Analytical Reading of Shakespeare's Sonnets. Dr. Ratna Guha Mustafi is a retired associate professor based in Kolkata. She has taught students in the Department of English for 32 years. Her specialization is on 19th century women novelists, with the Bronte sisters particularly under the prism. She has co-authored a book on Indian writing in English. Her critical writings on Jhumpa Lahiri, Nayantara Sehgal have been published in various journals. Recently, a paper on global warming was presented in an international conference. Her translation work on Suchitra Bhattacharya has been published, and another translation work on Begum Sufia Kamal is ready for publication. She engages in creative writing of fiction, non-fiction, and poetry. Her essays on Shakespearean sonnets and Wilfred Owen's war poetry have been published in a Bangla journal. She is very keen on gardening, traveling, and photography are her great passion.
Hello everyone. My best wishes for all young learners. Kudos to the Shakespeare Society of India East Zone for organizing the academic program Shakespeare the Whole Year. I am humbled and honored to have been invited by Dr. Naina De, Secretary the SSI East Zone, to make a presentation on Shakespeare's works. The topic of my discussion is a brief analytical reading of Shakespeare's sonnets. I would like to read out sonnet number 18 for the students to recollect the lines. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. The rhyme scheme, as all of you know, A B A B, C D C D, E F E F, G G. And in the first quatrain, we see it begins with a rhetorical question. That means the poet is in doubt, he's making a query. And in the second quatrain, he is trying to reason and he's placing an argument. And in the third, there is a little hope and he is glorifying. Finally, in the couplet, there is the resolution or the poet's solace. A great literary genius of the world, William Shakespeare is the greatest sonneteer of the Elizabethan period of English literature. It is estimated that Shakespeare the dramatist has overshadowed Shakespeare the sonneteer. Shakespeare's challenges to stick to the same structural form in composing his sonnet sequence of 154 poems find both appeal and appreciation of sonnet lovers even after more than 4 centuries. Findings by learned scholars ensure that readers are charmed by the sweet-sounding words, the sonorous alliterations, the appropriate rhythms, the beautiful images in the sonnets, in conjunction with the unalloyed sincerity and overwhelming intensity of passions. Francis Mears chose to call Shakespeare's sonnets as sugared sonnets. In his Palladis Tamia, Mears gives a contemporary report on Shakespeare's sonnets. As the soul of Euphorbus was thought to live in Pythagoras, so the sweet, witty soul of Ovid lives in mellifluous and honey-tongued Shakespeare. Witness is Venus and Adonis, his Lucrece, and his sugared sonnets. Poetry is a timeless art form, and this literary genre may be broadly classified as objective and subjective. Objective poetry can be further classified into narrative and dramatic types. Ballad, epic, and metrical romances are different forms of narrative poems. The subjective poetry refer to the lyric poems such as the elegy, the sonnet, ode, dramatic monologue, hymn, and epithalamion. The fulcrum of my argument is the lyric form of sonnet, and specifically Shakespearean sonnets. Like the lyric, which is also fairly short, the sonnet revolves around a single core emotion. Therefore, the sonnet differs from the lyric only in form. Arthur Compton Rickett tactfully distinguishes between the lyric and the sonnet by likening the lyric to the scent of a wayside flower and the sonnet effusing the fragrance of a well-ordered garden. Defining a sonnet merely by these characteristics would obviously pose a problem. There are changes and mutations, sometimes hidden or arbitrary, sometimes gradual or natural. In course of time, newer themes besides the love theme accrued to the sonnet. Again, all sonnets are not of 14 lines. There are sonnets of more than, that is, sonnet number 19, you will find 15 lines or less than 14 lines. Gerard Manley Hopkins, 1844 to 1889, presented a sort of curtailed sonnets known as curtal sonnets consisting only of 10 lines. These lines are divided into 2 stanzas, the first comprising 6 lines and the second 4 lines. A short tail piece is added which is not longer than half the length of a line. Example from Hopkins's poems: Glory be to God for dappled things. And the last tail piece, last line is Praise Him. You can check examples of Thomas Watson 1557 to 92, Passionate Century of Sonnets 1582, and John Donne's 1572 to 1631 sonnet sequence Holy Sonnets. The sonnet originated in Italy in the 13th century, and though Lentini invented the sonnet form, most of his poems are now in oblivion. The sonnet form was perfected by another Italian poet, Giton di Arezzo, 1230 to 1294. His invention of the rhyme scheme of octave was used by Dante 1265 to 1321 in his Vita Nuova. Petrarch 1304 to 1374 followed his rhyme scheme in his Canzoniere. Through Dante's and Petrarch's preferences, the rhyme scheme ABBA ABBA remained popular for a long time. Dante addressed his sonnets to his lady love Beatrice and Petrarch to his beloved Laura. Their loves were not carnal but purely platonic. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the Italian sonnet sailed to Spain, Portugal, France, the Netherlands, Poland, and England. Later, the sonnet form moved to Germany, Scandinavia, Russia, and to some other countries of the world. The sonnet form reached the shores of England in the first half of the 16th century, imbued with the spirit of Renaissance humanism. The God-centered consciousness of the medieval England gave way to man-centered consciousness. Man discovered himself being endowed with divine qualities. This deification of man brought in its wake an enlightened awareness about the most potent and excellent quality of man, the universal element of humanity, love, particularly the love between man and woman. And this love found its most fitting expression in the sonnet. Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, 1517 to 1547, and Sir Thomas Watt, 1503 to 1542, were the pioneers of sonnet writing in the 16th century England. Most of the poets of the Elizabethan period tried their hands in sonnetry and composed remarkable sonnet sequences. The popular sonneteers of the Elizabethan period were Philip Sidney, 1554 to 1586, Michael Drayton, 1563 to 1631, Edmund Spenser, 1527 to 1599, and crowning them all was William Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616. Though sonnets are of various types, only two types are essential for our discussion. Each of these two, in turn, has undergone various modifications by experimenters. The two characteristic sonnet types are the Italian or Petrarchan and the English or the Shakespearean. The Italian form is distinguished by its bipartite division into the octave and the sestet. The octave, consisting of a first division of 8 lines rhyming ABBA, ABBA, and the sestet or second division consisting of 6 lines rhyming CDE, 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 or CDE, DCE. Charles Gailey notes, the octave bears the burden, a doubt, a problem, a reflection, a query, an historical statement, a cry of indignation or desire, a vision of the ideal. The sestet eases the load, resolves the problem or doubt, answers the query, solaces the yearning, realizes the vision. Again, it might be said that the octave presents the narrative, states the proposition, or raises a question. The sestet drives home the narrative by making an abstract comment, applies the proposition, or solves the problem. The English poets have varied these items greatly. The octave and sestet division is not always kept. The rhyme scheme is often varied, but within limits. Iambic pentameter is essentially the meter, but here again, certain poets have experimented with hexameter and other meters. The English or Shakespearean sonnet, on the other hand, is so different from the Italian, though it grew from that form, that it falls into a separate classification. Instead of the octave and the sestet divisions, this sonnet characteristically embodies 4 divisions: 3 quatrains, each with a rhyme scheme of its own and a rhymed couplet. Thus, the typical rhyme scheme for the English sonnet is ABAB, CD, EF, GG. The couplet at the end is usually a commentary on the foregoing, an epigrammatic close. The Spenserian sonnet combines the Italian and the Shakespearean forms using 3 quatrains and a couplet, but employing linking rhymes between the quatrains. Thus, ABAB, BC, CD, EE. The form was introduced into England by Thomas Watt, who translated Petrarchan sonnets and left over 30 examples of his own in English. Surrey, an associate, shares with Watt the credit for introducing the form to England and is important as an early modifier of the Italian form. Gradually, the Italian sonnet pattern changed into the Shakespearean. Scholars and investigators could only surmise about Shakespeare's life and gathered clues that around 1586 he came to London to seek fortune with his family, Anne Hathaway, and 3 children. It is understood that he at first became a schoolmaster and then joined some touring performing companies of the metropolis, acting in minor roles. A.C. Ward furnished details about his lodging places. Within quotes, legal documents show that Shakespeare lived in Bishopgate in 1595, in Southwark in 1598, and in Cripplegate about 1604. It is also believed that Shakespeare certainly picked up friendship with the lawyer inmates of the Inns of Court and Chancery, as he found the environment intellectually very stimulating and literally very inspiring, as most of the inmates tried their hands in amateur sonneteering. Sonneting was in fashion in the years immediately following the defeat of the Armada, from 1588 to 1595. It reached its height after the publication of Philip Sidney's Astrophel and Stella in 1591. Thousands of love poems wherein the writers took upon themselves to quote exactly were circulated in manuscript. They were not intended for circulation. Shakespeare was inspired for sonnet writing, particularly influenced by established poets and dramatists such as Edmund Spenser, Michael Drayton, Philip Sidney, and Thomas Watson. Watson's passionate Centuries of Love 1582 and Love Disdained 1593 had a great influence over Shakespeare's fancy for the sonnet. Though the Italian form of the sonnet was in vogue, Shakespeare preferred the English form invented earlier by Thomas Watt. He chose not to confine the sonnet on the single theme of love, but experimented with themes such as time, despair grown out of unrequited love or worldly defeats, beauty of both male and female humans, even complex and ambivalent emotions such as love and hate for the same person. Most of the Elizabethan sonnets avoided publication and catered circulation only among friends and admirers. The collection of poems called Shakespeare's Sonnets, including 154 short poems or sonnets, was piratically published by Thomas Thorpe in 1609 in quarto edition, together with a poem called A Lover's Complaint. Had he not acted rashly at that time, we would not be able to witness the precious gems of English literature, as these would also be lost in oblivion. The precise order of the poems in Shakespeare's sonnet sequence has occasioned some scholarly dispute, although there is, in general, widespread agreement with a more or less standard order. Conventionally, the sonnets fall into three clear groupings. Sonnet 1 to 126 are addressed to or concern a fair youth or a young man. Sonnets 127 to 152 are addressed to or concern a dark lady, and sonnets 153 and 154 are fairly free adaptations of two classical Greek poems. Attributing 1 to 126 to a young man and sonnets 127 to 152 to a dark lady is somewhat problematical, since in many of the poems the gender of the person addressed is not at all clear, although sometimes it is. We have no clear mandate to interpret poems invoking my love as referring necessarily to a male or to a female, since the term is used to refer to both sexes equally. Shakespeare's sonnets may, however, be treated as independent poems, or may be studied as short sequences of a few poems, as many are linked together by subject matter. We can also consider the entire sonnet sequence to form a coherent or semi-coherent narrative. As mentioned earlier, that the sonnet sequence 1 to 126 are devoted to a handsome youth, Shakespeare addresses his beloved as a sweet boy, my lovely boy, with a woman's face. There are several interesting conjectures regarding the identity of the young man. Of the sonnets in question. I will not confound you with all details, but mention only two persons whom we can genuinely identify to be our poet's close friend. This biographical hunt is quite a natural instinct in all human beings, but an art form moves much forward than the personal. In reading the sonnets, the questions like who is the young man, who are the rival poet and the dark lady haunt us. One vital clue is acquired from the dedication to the sonnets, declaring that Mr. W.H. is the only begetter of these ensuing sonnets. It is understood that Shakespeare purposely used Mr. or Master before the initials of the name with the sole intention of concealing W.H.'s identity and social standing. All conjectures related to Mr. WH and also the lady love are shrouded in mystery. And to some investigators, all the personalities involved in his sonnet writing may be fanciful or a faint shadow of his very dear acquaintances. Most literary scholars vie to put forward the third Earl of Southampton, 1573 to 1624, who was a man of extraordinary good looks. The Earl was none other than Henry Wriothesley, for whom John Clapham, the Clerk of Chancery, had already dedicated a Latin poem based on the story of Narcissus in an attempt to flatter the young man, encouraging him to marry and procreate. It is interesting to note that in Elizabethan England, boys of 17 or 18 did get married and did settle down, which implicates that Shakespeare's first 17 sonnets could have been a genuine gift on Southampton's 17th birthday in October 1590. A rumor went round that despite requests, Southampton had refused to marry Elizabeth de Vere. We have seen that Southampton is HW, and in 1598-99, when the sonnets were nearing completion, he was old enough to be called a lovely boy. There are other fellows who are suspected to be Shakespeare's WH. Like Oscar Wilde was in favor of a handsome actor called Willie Hughes, others named William Hart, the poet's infant nephew. William Herbert, the third Earl of Pembroke, was the son of Mary Pembroke, and Mary was Philip Sidney's sister. Herbert's reluctance to marry and his rejection to several proposed brides is much like WH's much publicized unwillingness to choose a wife. Moreover, Mary Fitton is believed to have borne the Earl an illegitimate child, and so he could easily have been WH and Mary the Dark Lady. Hallett Smith observes, within quotes, "Of all the poetry of the Elizabethan period, these sonnets have suffered most from the 19th century obsession with the biographical relation between poet and poetry. It has become impossible for the modern reader to approach and examine these sonnets with a fresh eye. It has become impossible for the modern reader to approach and examine these sonnets with a fresh eye. Hallett Smith points out that these conjectures have no scientific or historical validity. They are looking for scraps of diary or personal letters, more interested in the man than in his work. He believes that we ought to concern ourselves with the themes, the imagery, the structure, and the temper of the sonnets themselves. Their life and significance come from their value as poetry. Now, I will begin my discussion of the sonnets. The very first sonnet, the lines I am going to read out, the first quatrain: "From fairest creatures we desire increase, that thereby beauty's rose might never die. But as the riper should by time decease, his tender air might bear his memory." Even in sonnet number 2, the first quatrain, he says, "When 40 winters shall besiege thy brow and dig deep trenches in thy beauty's field, thy youth's proud livery, so gazed on now, will be a tattered weed of small worth held." And in the couplet, he writes, "This were to be new made when thou art old, and see thy blood warm when thou feelest it cold." In the third sonnet, sonnet number 3, the first two lines, look in thy glass and tell the face thou viewest. Now is the time that face should form another. And in the couplet, but if thou live remembered not to be, die single, and thine image dies with thee. Sonnet number 6, in the couplet he says, be not self-willed, for thou art much too fair to be death's conquest and make worms thine heir. H-E-I-R. In sonnet number 7, in the couplet he says, so thou thyself outgoing in thy noon, unlooked on diest, unless thou get a son. All the above sonnets bring into sharp focus the fair youth whose beauty the poet shudders will become the target of nature's course, and the time will triumphantly dig trenches in beauty's field only to fade away and perish. This consistent fear of the loss of his friend's beauty sets a warning bell to the youth, who is now full of vigor and vitality. The nature and kind of beauty is not expressed, but the poet insists the young man to preserve through progeny. In sonnet number 15 he writes in the couplet, and all in war with time for love of you, as he takes from you, I engraft you new. I engraft you new. Sonnet 13 again, against this coming and you should prepare, and your sweet semblance to some other give. In the couplet, dear my love, you know you had a father, let your son say so. In sonnet number 16, in the first quatrain, in sonnet number 16, the first quatrain, wherefore do not you a mightier way make war upon this bloody tyrant time, and fortify yourself in your decay with means more blessed than my barren rhyme? Sonnet 17, the first line, who will believe my verse in time to come? And later he says, if I could write the beauty of your eyes, and in fresh numbers number all your graces. And in the couplet, the same 17, sonnet number 17, were some child of yours alive that time, you should live twice, in it and in my rhyme. We have noticed that from sonnet number 1 to 17, the poet appeals to his male friend to tie a knot in marriage and preserve his lineage and noble ancestry. It is said that these 17 sonnets are powerful procreation sonnets, setting eugenic propositions. Mark sonnet number 17, where the poet writes, if he could write the beauty of his friend's eyes and could enumerate his graces, he is almost close to describing the youth, but halts, leaving the reader curiosity suitably aroused, but not suitably satisfied. With sonnet number 18 that I read at first, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? We find traces of the handsome youth through interesting comparisons. establishing the fact that his friend is more beautiful than a summer's day. He is more lovely, pleasant, and temperate. Nature almost fades into insignificance when compared to the enviable beauty of the young earl because it is mutable and impermanent. The darling buds of May fall prey to stormy weather before they are able to blossom. Even the much awaited English summer has a temporary existence. The sun's warmth and glow lack consistency, pervading a gloom. Sometimes, when the sun is blazing bright, it causes discomfort. So, the poet establishes the fact that neither is summer as temperate and mild and as pleasing as the young man's beauty, nor is the sun as constant or immutable. However, the poet is also too aware of the painful truth that beauty is transient, mutable, and will fade either due to some chance happening that is beyond human control or owing to nature's design and the steady passage of time. After this argument, the poet finds a ray of hope and assures his friend that his beauty will remain untarnished and he will succeed in defying death, as he will remain immortalized through the poet's verse. His memory will remain alive for centuries to come, and he vows that as long as humans exist on earth and so long they read his verses, he will remain immortalized in their heart. He chides death but indulges in self-glorification, imitating Ovid in using poetry as a powerful antidote. We have seen how in sonnet number 17, Shakespeare is talking about the inadequacy of his verse or his inability to describe the young man's beauty and excellence. But in sonnet number 18, a much read and a popular one, gives us another picture. So sonnet number 18 can be cited as an example in support of the claim that it is rather futile to look for constancy of thought or argument in this sonnet sequence, as Shakespeare has repeatedly contradicted himself unhesitatingly with no apology. In sonnet number 19, the poet announces with barely concealed pride, "Yet do thy worst, old time, despite thy wrong, my love shall in my verse ever live young." There is no trace of the uncertainty that often disturbed him in the earlier sonnets. Instead, we hear the voice of the poet after a careful assessment and estimation of his own verse. He has now arrived at the conclusion that his sonnets will stand the test of time. He was assured that his powerful verse will both challenge and defeat time and thereby immortalize Mr. W.H. In sonnet number 11, Shakespeare wrote, "Thou shouldest print more, not let that copy die." The word print, carefully chosen, means little more than fathering a child. Then in sonnet number 18, the poet, more confident about the power of his lines, sees himself in the role of a protector and a preserver. Having a young man as his subject in 1 to 126 sonnets marks his uncommon and unconventional choice. He has deliberately chosen to be unconventional in his sonnet sequence. Sonnet 55 is another example of his confidence. The lines, "Not marble nor the gilded monuments of princes shall outlive this powerful rhyme. Your praise shall still find room even in the eyes of all posterity. Till the judgment that yourself arise, you live in this and dwell in lovers' eyes." Sonnet number 63 announces, "His beauty shall in these black lines be seen, and they shall live, and he in them still green." Immediately after, in sonnet number 64, we hear the note of despair. "Time will come and take my love away. This thought is as a death, which cannot choose but weep to have that which it fears to lose." In the final couplet of sonnet 18, we find a slight curtness of tone and a rather dispassionate placing of the argument that both his verse and the youth's beauty can elude time and emerge victorious. This is perhaps a defense to counter unkind comments on his inclinations and on the nature of his love for W.H. Shakespeare's attempt to preserve the beauty of his friend in his verse sometimes fatally proved wrong, as an end is inevitable. But we find in sonnet number 60 the lines of counterattack on time. "As the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end. Yet to times in hope my verse shall stand, praising thy worth despite his cruel hand." Sonnets number 71 to 74 veer around the consciousness of his own mortality. The three quatrains focus on the actuality of fading, receding, and dying, the barren and hollow future towards which all mortals must move. Sonnet number 73 focuses on the autumn of human life. Death is certain and inescapable. Time is the healer and destroyer. In 73, Shakespeare writes, "That time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves or none or few do hang." Then again, after few lines, "Death's second self that seals up all in rest. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well which thou must leave ere long." The poet feels that the consciousness of his approaching end will make the young man love him with greater warmth and intensity. But the law of nature will separate the friend from the poet. It is now too late for the friend to remain attached to the poet, as the poet has submitted to the fate of his life and faced the end of his life. Sonnet number 77 warns us all of the future fate. In maturity and old age, we all reap the harvest sown in our youthful days. Sonnets number 78 to 86. The subject that consistently recurs is the rivalry of other poets trying to split their relationship. A rival poet comes upon the scene who secures the favor of Shakespeare's friend. This rival poet also appears to be his patron. We witness a competitive strain in the sonnets where he appears fearful for the loss of his friendship due to some very powerful, influential personalities trying to outwit and captivate his friend. We can assume that contemporary writers vying for the poet's attention and interest were Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, Chapman, Tubersville, and others. It has been surmised that the idea of the rival poet may be imaginative and fanciful, clouding Shakespeare's mind of losing his passionate friend and patron in Mr. W.H. Shakespeare dubiously thinks that the rival poet is posing a challenge to break their bond of friendship, thereby separating him from his lovely boy. He warns his friend that the rival poets showering honor upon him are tactfully intriguing against them both out of prejudice. This is just a strategy to win over Mr. W.H.'s heart and soul, and Shakespeare forbids him to be swayed by the rival poet's open challenge. For the rival poets, Shakespeare in sonnet number 78 writes, "In others' works thou dost but mend your style," and glorifies his friend by exhorting him to be his muse. He writes, "I have invoked thee for my muse, and found such fair assistance in my verse." The poet has acknowledged the fair youth and has given him due honor to be his muse. That is, a source of artistic inspiration, a position of the goddess of poetic inspiration. He seeks the aid of the quintessential and his own muse so that he can develop his literary and creative style. He tells his friend, again this is in sonnet number 78, be most proud of that which I compile, whose influence is thine and born of thee. Thou art all my art. In his art, his friend's influential position stands high above all else. The friend should boast of the poet's artistic creations as he is morally and divinely inclined by his friend's association. In the same sonnet, he writes, "Thine eyes that taught the dumb on high to sing." In the classical strain, the poet informs that when he becomes speechless and unnerved, then his friend's bright and beautiful eyes overwhelm him, and in his love for his friend, his soul cries out a loving song. He composes sonnets in this strain of love for the handsome youth. For example, in sonnet number 29, he writes, "Haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate." To the poet it appears that like the lark, he sings in praise of his friend in a high-pitched note standing at the heaven's gate. In sonnet number 78, he writes, "Every alien pen hath got my use." He mentions about all unknown competitors or writers who seem to intrude into their union. And when we find a line in sonnet number 36 where he writes, "Though our undivided loves are one, they wish to encroach upon our privacy only to motivate my muse and break our relationship." Sonnets 40 to 42 throw different color of relationship. In these sonnets, the poet's friend steals the heart of the poet's mistress or dark lady, References of this relationship are also made in sonnets number 133, 134 and 144. Now there's a line in sonnet number 42 where he says, "Thou dost love her because thou knowest I love her." The poet grieves that his own dear friend is involved in an illicit relationship by suing his own mistress. The poet is also shocked that the dark lady, his mistress, has been able to overpower his youthful friend emotionally. So, to the poet, both his mistress and his friend are to be blamed. But he is ready to forgive his friend. In sonnet number 42, he writes, "I will excuse E." He assured himself that his friend has been mistreated, mishandled by the lady. And in sonnet number 40, Shakespeare is annoyed and hurt by his dark mistress, and he writes, "I cannot blame thee, for my love thou usest, but yet be blamed. I do forgive thy robbery, gentle thief." After a few lines, "Love knows it is a greater grief to bear love's wrong than hate's known injury." On the other hand, he also conjectured that this melodrama may be a strategy of his mistress to find out the poet's love for her. He could not approve of the fact that for the dark lady he would have to suffer deprivation and loss of his friend. In sonnet number 41 he writes, "I am sometime absent from thy heart, and when a woman woos, what woman's son will surely leave her till she have prevailed?" After a few lines, "Thou art forced to break a twofold truth, hers by thy beauty, tempting her to thee, thine by thy beauty being false to me." He suspects that the dark lady would win over the company of his friend. So he writes, "Both find each other, and I lose both twain," in sonnet number 42. Now, pondering over the fact, the poet was determined to find a resolution to the problem, and thus he knew that both his mistress and his friend were testing the poet's true and undying love for them both. So they are not to be blamed, and it is only for him and his true love they took refuge to this plan of action. In sonnet number 42, the poet writes, "Both for my sake lay on me this cross, but here's the joy." After a few lines he says, "But here's the joy, my friend and I are one." And then finally, "She loves but me alone." In the same strain, the poet's painful appeal is heard in sonnet number 134, where he writes, "I have confessed that he is thine, and I myself am mortgaged to thy will. Myself I'll forfeit, so that other mine thou wilt restore to be my comfort still." Now the tone of the sonnet is somber, with the usage of legal terms used by the poet. His friend was the bearer of his love message to the dark lady, and here he was entrapped. The poet therefore blames himself. He writes in sonnet number 134, "He learned, but surety like to write for me, under that bond that him as fast doth bind." Due to this bond, the poet's relationship with the dark lady became so strong. the statute of thy beauty thou wilt take. This bond allowed the dark lady to covet everything that the poet has, and for this both the poet and his friend came directly under her control. The poet addresses the lady to be a usurer, and it is for the lady that his friend was in debt and had to surrender to her wishes. Again, in sonnet number 134, we find these two lines: Thou usurer that puttest forth all to use, and sue a friend came debtor for my sake. Estranged from his friend, the poet always blamed himself. In the same sonnet, he writes, So him I lose through my unkind abuse. The poet is distanced from his friend, and therefore he faces defeat and loss. On the other hand, the dark lady overpowers both the poet and his friend, and thereby wins over two male lovers. In the same sonnet, 134, he writes, Him have I lost, then colon, thou hast both him and me, again colon, he pays the whole, yet am I not free. The poet is burdened under the dark lady's vanity. The sad note of the poet's defeat and loss move the reader's heart and mind, and so they are attracted and remain attached with the sonnets. Sonnet number 116 offers a moving rendition of a soul caught in torment over unrequited love. As in the two earlier sonnets, here too the poet seems engaged in a monologue, but in a tone that is decidedly firm and confident. In sonnet number 115, he wrote, Love is a babe. Then might I not say so, to give full growth to that which still doth grow, So to grow and deepen, change is constant. In 116, the poet is determined not to place obstacles in the path of love or delay or disallow the union of two minds. Here, he is not finding any fault of his or his friend, but delved deeply into the thoughts of pure love or true love. Firm in his conviction, he says that love is not true love if it fails to stand the test of time and prove its constancy. If there is an alteration in love, or the emotion has varying intensities and fluctuates due to external or internal circumstances of the beloved, then it cannot claim to be pure love. Love is considered noble when it is stable, constant, and not subject to changes owing to external causes. Bright and unwavering, like the beacon showing the way to lost ships, love is also a fixed mark. Love is never at the mercy of time, even though the tyrant is empowered to deface rosy lips and cheeks, thereby destroying youthful beauty and vigor. It is axiomatic that time's sickle spares none, but true love does not alter with time. It is constant, unchangeable, and permanent. Since the poet's belief in the power of love is unshakable, he can boldly assert that if he is proven wrong and if his claim is contested and refuted, he will vow that no man has ever loved truly, nor has he ever written. This sonnet, number 116, is open and loud in its praise of the glory of pure and true love, which baffles time and frustrates its dark intentions. We have seen the first 17 procreation sonnets where Shakespeare has marked progeny and poetry as the two most powerful antidotes to time. Love till then was not viewed is offered as another alternative after sonnet number 18. It can bring two individuals closer to each other, forge a relationship and strengthen it further, and remain unaltered despite turbulence around the world. Love, indestructible and invaluable, is as fixed as the northern star. Yet this love that guides, sustains and ennobles has had to face several charges, and not entirely without reason. The final words of the sonnet, "Nor no man ever loved," opens up a, I quote, subtle negation of the assertion of love's fixity. For if the speaker's writing is to be equated with all men's loving, then there is more scope for doubt than faith. The constant play between truth and falsehood, between alteration and fixity, the realization that everything carries within itself its other, derived not only from the polarity of good and evil taught by religion, but also and more powerfully in Shakespeare's time from the polarity in religion itself embodied by the violent Protestant Catholic strife. The notion of flux and fluidity, also owed to the constantly changing borders of Elizabethan knowledge, to the discovery of new lands, new races, new sights, sounds, and sensations. Unquote. Sonnet number 126 has only 12 lines and written in couplets that form an envoy to the series addressed to my lovely boy. Now I'll mention a little mention of sonnet number 99, which I missed, which I mentioned 19, that was a slip of tongue. It has more than 14 lines, that is 15 lines. So that correction must be done. In sonnet number 130, the poet has presented an example of anti-sonnet. In the Fair Youth sonnets, the poet has showered his love and praise for his beloved, whereas in this anti-sonnet, the poet, though in love with his mistress, cannot find the conventional graces of beauty in her, but accepts her uncommon and unconventional looks and gestures. He writes in sonnet number 130, all of you are familiar with this very popular and interesting sonnet. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips is red. After a few lines, black wires grow on her head. Again, no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in the couplet he says, and yet by heaven I think my love so rare, as rare, and yet by heaven I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. Shakespeare in his sonnet number 144 tries to analyze on his own the relationship that ensued between the fair youth and the dark lady. Poetic interpreters have identified this sonnet as a monologue. Now he considers uh, and writes in the sonnet, "Two loves I have, of comfort and despair, the better angel, the worser spirit, a woman coloured ill, to win me soon to hell, my female evil, tempteth my better angel from my side." Again, after few lines, "Corrupt my saint to be a devil, wooing his purity with her foul pride." Again, finally, "Till my bad angel fire my good one out." Even though the poet has given priority to the nobility of the soul, yet he confesses that he is unable to resist his carnal inclinations in sonnet number 147. He is tempted to put his emotion in verse. He writes, "My love is as a fever, longing still for that which longer nurseth the disease." After few lines, "My reason, the physician to my love," again after that, "hath left me, and I desperate now approve, desire is death." Sonnet number 149 presents the two selves of the speaker. The poet's one self is seen to be attracted and drawn towards the dark lady, and the poet's other self is unwilling to pay attention to her or be indulgent towards her. He writes, "Canst thou, O cruel, say I love thee not?" After some time he writes, "Now I know thy mind. Those that can see thou lovest, and I am blind." Sonnet number 152 has been interpreted as a complicated sonnet because in it the woman, her husband, the friend, and the poet are involved. Besides, the poet voices his marital vows promised to his wife, Anne Hathaway. In 152 he writes, "In loving thee thou knowest I am forsworn. I have sworn deep oaths of thy deep kindness, oaths of thy love, thy truth, thy constancy." Now, when Shakespeare was composing sonnets 153 and 154, the last two sonnets of the sonnet sequence, his narration referred to an age-old, amusing classical Greek story of the love god Cupid and moon goddess Diana of the 5th century AD. In sonnet number 153, he writes, "Cupid laid by his brand and fell asleep. A maid of Dian's this advantage found." After few lines, "I sick withal the help of bath desired." Again after some lines, "but found no cure." After a few lines again, "Where Cupid got new fire, my mistress's eyes." Now when Cupid, the story goes like this, when Cupid fell asleep, his love kindling fire or torch was beside him. Seeing this, the nymphs of Diana saw this and dipped the torch into the cold waters of the fountain that spread the sacred fire of love in the mountainous region. That water body turned into a huge bathtub, and it was known that after having spa in the waters, one could recover from any disease. The bathtub became the healer of all maladies. Citing the narration of the story, the poet mentions that in his mistress's eye, love's brand new fire is kindling bright. Cupid, in order to find whether the poet's heart is also burning with love, touched him gently. In order to cleanse his physical ailments, the poet immersed himself in the warmth of love, but his maladies were not cured. The malady of being in love. This made him feel desperate and melancholic. Cupid's love fire shot in his mistress's eyes, so the poet wants to delve deep into her eyes to feel the warmth of love. He will have to console himself being in the passionate love fire of his mistress's eyes, which slowly will increase the warmth and passion of love. Nothing can destroy the warmth of love. Therefore, the poet is hopeful of their love to increase and deepen in time to come. In sonnet number 154, therefore, the last line, the poet writes, "Love's fire heats water, water cools not love." Thank you.